I want to welcome you to this Sunday evening service of First Baptist Church in Lucedale, Mississippi. You're joining us for the study of experiencing soul rest, and this is session 2. You may not understand what soul rest is or how to get to a place of soul rest in your own life, but on these Sunday nights, that's what we're going to be talking about. And tonight, I'm going to talk to you about the dark tombs of spiritual failure. There's a verse in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 14, that is precious to me. Let me read that verse to you. For we will surely die and are like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be gathered up again. Yet God does not take away life, but plans ways so that the banished one may not be cast out from him. This verse comes out of the story of David and his relationship with his own son, Absalom. Absalom had been living in rebellion against his father. David knew what it was like to live in rebellion against God, and Absalom's own rebellion was hurting him as his rebellion had hurt the heart of God. But David was not quick to show mercy to Absalom. And yet, the word of the Lord to David toward his own son Absalom was that he needed to be merciful. He needed to remember that he too had experienced spiritual failure in his life. Absalom needed mercy, just like David needed mercy. You know, as we talk about spiritual failure, one of the things that we're going to have to admit, I have to admit it, and you do as well, that all of us at one time or another experience spiritual failure. In fact, you might find yourself right now tonight living in one of those dark tombs of spiritual failure. What is spiritual failure? Let me define it for you. Spiritual failure is a state of spiritual exhaustion so profound that it results in disillusionment, depression, defeat, or even disaster. Often one of these will walk hand in hand with another. Most of us have experienced spiritual failure to one degree or another. You can probably recall a time in your life when you disappointed God, disappointed yourself, or disappointed someone else. The good news is that God has a way of even using our failures to bring us to the oasis of His presence. A man named Fred Lair wrote a book called Clergy Burnout. And in his book, he points out that quite often the most significant transition or transformation in a person's life comes as an encounter with spiritual failure. He describes failure in this way. He says, it is the disillusion of our naivete. It is the harsh realization that our simplistic, black and white, concrete answers to life's very complex problems just don't work. It is a time of painful coming to terms with the truth that we don't have the wisdom we thought we had, and that we really have just begun in this pilgrimage to spiritual maturity. For many, this is a point of dropping out. They say, look, it doesn't work. As hard as I tried, I couldn't achieve the level of purity I desired. So forget it. I'm out. It doesn't work. But failure is one way God brings us to an awareness of our personal weakness and of His strength. Henry and Richard Blackaby, in their book Spiritual Leadership, observe it is significant to note from biblical examples that God seldom intervened when people were about to make mistakes. Rather, He allowed them to fail, but stood ready to redeem them. Many individuals through the process of failure and redemption saw God's character revealed in a deeper dimension than if God had just simply stepped in and helped them avoid their failure. In his book, Mid-Course Correction, Gordon MacDonald shares some tidbits of wisdom he gleaned in a conversation with his high school track coach. On one occasion, his track coach allowed MacDonald to run a race, and to run that race his own way, knowing that he would lose. The coach knew he would lose, and knowing that the loss would hurt the team. This is what Gordon MacDonald observed in that lesson that his coach allowed him to learn. He said, like Jesus, my coach understood that failure is a master teacher if it has a willing student. He knew that few things would gain the attention of this would-be listener better than a moment in which there is humiliations. Almost all the great lessons on character that I have learned have come through one form of failure or another. Now, I don't like failure of any kind, and I'm sure you don't either. But let's face it, in the Christian life, we all fail, and we must learn from our failures. Now, this study grows out of my own disgust with the lack of spiritual progress I was making in my own life. It came at a time when the Lord gave me a good look at my own heart. I understood what God meant when he said in the book of Jeremiah that the heart is more deceitful than all else and desperately sick. As hard as I tried to transform my own heart, it didn't work. There were times when I didn't know whether I had abandoned God or God had abandoned me. It seemed to me that sin just had a greater and greater grip on my life, so much so that I was helpless to free myself from its grasp. And I began to realize that if what I was preaching, and by the way, I was preaching all this time, if what I was preaching had no impact on my life, how in the world could I expect it to work in the lives of others? So I cried out to God and I asked God to show me what was missing in me. Why was it that in spite of all my efforts, that I was like the woman with the issue of blood? I was no better. In fact, I was only worse. Some call this discouraging period in the spiritual life the dark night of the soul. It's a time when it seems as though a dark cloud and a wall of stone stand between the soul and God. Peter Scazzaro, in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, explains the somber reality that faces us when we hit that wall. He said, we discover for the first time that our faith does not appear to work. We have more questions than answers, as the very foundation of our faith itself feels like it's on the line. We don't know where God is. We don't know what God is doing. We don't know where he is going or how he is getting us there or when this will be over. It's not simply a one-time event that we pass through and get beyond. It seems to be something that we return to again and again as part of our ongoing relationship with God. But I can tell you that for me, it was just not a dark night of the soul. It seemed more like a dark decade. Sickened by the sight of my own heart, I knew that God must be thoroughly disgusted with me. And so I began to just pray through the Gospel of John, searching for an answer. Did I think I would find the answer in the Gospel of John? I had no clue of where I was going to find answers. It just seemed to me like John was a place to go, and I started reading the Gospel of John and praying that God would show me something. Then I came to the story of Lazarus, and I realized when I read that story that I was Lazarus. I was dead. I was wretched. I was helpless. I was odious in the sight of God, and if the stone had been rolled away from my heart, I would have been odious to others. So for days, I just pondered that story. I knew that Jesus called Lazarus out of his tomb. Couldn't he call me out of my own dark night? And little by little, God began to put the pieces together for me. You see, spiritual fatigue and even spiritual failure can be God's way of alerting us to personal spiritual weakness. It's in His love and in His mercy, He brings us to an awareness of the profound reality of our own sinfulness. In fact, in his little devotional book, My Utmost for His Highest, it's a little book, by the way, but it is in no way little spiritually, Oswald Chambers offers the following insight. He said, when God wants to show you what human nature is like apart from Himself, He has to show it to you in yourself. If the Spirit of God has given you a vision of what you are apart from the grace of God, and He only does that when His Spirit is at work, you know there is no criminal who is half so bad in actuality as you know yourself to be in possibility. Chambers says, my grave has been opened by God, and I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. God's Spirit continually reveals what human nature is like apart from His grace. So in the story of Lazarus, when Jesus asked Martha to have someone remove the stone, Jesus was fully aware of the decay inside. He also knows about the decay that resides in your heart and in mine. Lazarus was dead. He was helpless to change his circumstances. There was not one spark of life in him. What needed to happen in him was something only Jesus could do. Somehow I sensed that as I read that story over and over, that the secret of my own spiritual transformation was contained in the story of Lazarus. And so I just pored over those verses, looking for something I might have missed. And all at once, I saw something that I had never seen before. Maybe you've never seen it. You see, when Jesus came to the tomb, He prayed, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. Jesus prayed at the tomb of Lazarus. But what did He pray? You see, we don't know. Jesus' prayer is not recorded. However, He asked the Father to do something. And when He prayed, whatever those words were when He prayed, when they removed the stone, Lazarus, the man who had been dead, was able to come forth. Now, how does the story of Lazarus apply to you and me? Well, you see, as long as we believe that we're just a little sick with sin, we mistakenly believe that through some effort of our own, we can do better. But Lazarus had to die to experience God's glory. It was not just enough to be sick. He had to die. The work the Lord desires to do in your life will not take place as long as you believe that you can accomplish it in your own strength. It'll take more than you can do. Attempts to remove the grave clothes, to unwind the wrappings of sin before life has been imparted, are simply futile. That is why so many church leaders and so many church members languish. So when I made that discovery, I simply prayed, Lord, would you speak the words over my heart that you spoke over the tomb of Lazarus? I want to pass out of this death, this dark night, into the light of life, and that continues to be my cry. I'm learning that life comes not from my own efforts, but from the activity of my Lord. He is my life. It's not what I do, it's Him. I simply have no life of my own. Only the person who desperately desires to be what God wants them to be will feel the sting of spiritual failure. So as you listen, perhaps an odor is leaching from your heart. You've known long there was deadness there, and like me, you've tried various preparations to cover the aroma so that no one else will discover what you know to be true. I remind you of the prodigal who spent many days thinking he could work his way out of the stinking mess he had made of his life. His only hope lay in returning to his father. Only God can wash your heart from the stench of sin. He alone can put a ring on your finger, shoes on your feet, and wrap you in the robe of his righteousness. There is no place so dark as the tomb of spiritual failure. However, it's out of these tombs, these dark places of failure, that true spiritual transformation begins. Now, I remind you that spiritual failure left untreated can be the end of the road for a servant of God. However, when we allow God to shine the light of his presence and truth into the tomb of spiritual failure, resurrection is possible. I told you about that book that I read by Gordon MacDonald way back in 1986. I told you about that last week. It was called Ordering Your Private World. That book had a profound impact on my life, as many other books by Gordon MacDonald have had on my life. But one of the things that I didn't know when I read that book, that Gordon MacDonald had passed through his own dark night of spiritual failure. As tragic as his failure was for himself and those around him, MacDonald discovered that God has the power to redeem our failures. He writes, "These experiences of brokenness often serve as turnaround moments, ushering us into a period of more effective service." What God is able to do in and through the life of that person depends on their response to that season of brokenness. If that brokenness prompts us to seek the Lord, then there's a refreshing and a restoring that will take place in our lives. There was another lesson I learned, and it was from the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah is a pretty good book, and as I pondered the verses looking for some spiritual answers for my own life in the book of Nehemiah, I read those first chapters and I saw Nehemiah standing in the rubble of Jerusalem. As he looked at Jerusalem, in many ways, he was reviewing the condition of his own heart. The journey of restoration always begins with a review of the ruins. God showed Nehemiah what was, so that he could show him what could be. Listen, there are spiritual ruins in every life. Don't despair. God has a plan for transformation. He knows what is needed in your life. And the place of transformation is the place of his presence. At his feet, you and I find soul rest. Have you experienced spiritual failure? Look, no matter how bad it was or how long you've been there, God wants to call you out of that place into the light of his presence. Would you ask God to speak over your deadness, the words that he spoke over the tomb of Lazarus? Would you say, God, would you please call me out of death and into life? Listen, it's not something you can do. It's something only God can do. And it's something God wants to do in your life so that you can truly experience soul rest. Thank you so much for listening. God bless you.